Hey everybody, welcome to the Sustainability in Motion podcast brought to you by ED4S. We focus on the fast-moving sustainability world to help the business community better understand sustainability and environmental challenges we face. I'm Matt Orsag, Chief Content Officer at ED4S.
And I am Noah Al-Sadi, CEO and founder of Canada Advisors and Chief Advisor to ED4S.
We have as our guest today Rolando Morillo, Senior Vice President and Portfolio Manager of Thematic Investment Strategies at Rockefeller Capital Management. And today we're going to talk about the blue economy. Welcome, Rolando. Thanks for coming.
No, and thank you both, Matt and Noir. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about this topic because it's what we haven't done. And of course, the ocean, is 2/3 of our planet and really, part of our life support system we don't really think about. So I think it's a very important podcast topic that usually kind of gets overlooked. But I want to ask you, what initially drew you to build an investment strategy that aligns with ocean conversation? What journey brought you there?
Yeah, sure. I'll go into the history. So I'm going to go back maybe about 12, almost 13 years when we started Climate Solution Strategy. And what we did back then is to really go and get the perspective from different scientific advisors, NGOs, and there was one in particular called the Ocean Foundation that gave us a very different perspective, but one that we felt was not only interesting, but one that I felt was underappreciated. They basically described the whole notion of the ocean being the regulator of the planet's global climate system. And so when you think about it in that way, the ocean is actually quite important for a variety of different purposes, let alone the fact that it's composed of 3/4 of water. And obviously the ocean is a big piece of that. But understanding that and understanding, in terms of how we think about the issues impacting climate was where we started to really understand this whole notion of the climate ocean nexus, which is how I like to term it. And so over the years, we built a very good partnership with the Ocean Foundation, one that we still continue to have today. They're an advisor for us. And what led us to think about a specific ocean strategy was after years of understanding, what are the different areas within what we term as the blue economy that are interesting. We felt like this was a different strategy and a bit more specific and focused, again, around how we think about what is the blue economy. The blue economy was actually was a concept that really started to take hold in many respects. I'd say in the last, 8 to 10 years. And so we started to then delve further into that. And so that is what led us to then focus on what was our second thematic strategy.
I think that's helpful. And it's a good segue to a question I wanted to ask you, Rolando, maybe just to actually level set. How big is the blue economy? And I don't know if you can share with us examples of, what sectors are part of the blue economy. I think a lot of people have heard that term, but they may not have clarity exactly of how big it is and what it entails. And the fact that it actually been involved with it for about a decade now, I don't know if you can give us also a sense of how it has evolved over this period.
Yeah, no, definitely. So how we think about the blue economy is actually, in many ways, thinking about what are the different industries and the different sectors that have linkages to ocean health. And so in many respects, you have industries that obviously have a direct impact and others that have an indirect impact, but nonetheless are important. And so we think about the blue economy in a very broad way in order to also provide a level of diversification in terms of what that universe actually looks like. So just to give you some examples, we think about the opportunity set really in two major pillars. So pollution prevention and ocean conservation. So under pollution prevention, we're thinking about the companies that essentially are having some sort of aspect of pollution, the plastics, really also focused in and around the whole notion of the circular economy, but actually embedding it within the business model. And so here are companies that can basically be anywhere from packaging companies, companies that are in the bottling industry that are focused on alternative packaging or thinking about sustainability in that aspect, to even companies, that are part of the waste management industry, which there are a number, not only here in the United States, but in and around the world, that what we're seeing is they are really deploying capital expenditures to automate and to really think about, how to put a value on that waste versus it having to go in a landfill. And then what we're seeing is that, eventually that waste that goes to landfill ends up going into, streams, rivers, and eventually into oceans. And so you want to also think about where the source of the problem is. And so these are the companies that in many respects, you want to not only understand, identify, but you want to engage with them because you want to understand, are they thinking about this? Because these are long-term issues. We're long-term investors. So it's the right time frame, the right timeline to really understand these issues and to invest in that fashion. And so if you take waste management, for instance, this is an area that we think is an important piece because they're basically thinking about waste as secondary waste streams because you're seeing demand for recycled products from a number of different consumer areas. And so this is where you're starting to see a real solution. And they're also thinking about not having exposure, not being part of the pollution that is actually happening, whether it's here in North America, Europe, or even in Asia. These are some of the areas that we're thinking about. Now, another area that's important, ocean conservation. This is where you start to get into some of the more, let's just say, typical industries where you would probably think has a direct impact to ocean health. So think of shipping, think of companies in the commercial fishing space, aquaculture. And so these are companies that actually operate in the ocean and certainly have a responsibility in terms of stewardship to, make sure that they're not polluting, but that, they're actually enhancing whatever environment that they're operating in. I would add ports, infrastructure in that space as well. And so what we've done here is really focus on what we think are the companies that have the right fundamental attributes longer term as an investment, have the ability for us to engage so that we can understand what is material about their sustainability strategy. Because ultimately we think the companies that are implementing, these sort of initiatives, in many respects, what they're doing is positioning themselves to have a competitive advantage, whether it's to lower costs, to get ahead of regulation. This is why it's important for us to really engage with these companies on these issues. And for some of them, they take it seriously. For others, I think they're relatively early in that journey. And so what we try to do is focus on a number of companies that are within that spectrum of focusing on that sustainability aspect that is linked to ocean health.
Maybe just a quick follow-up, if I may, Matt, because that's very interesting, Rolando, because in a way it seems like you've created your own classification or methodology, at least to look at companies in these two buckets. But you have not shared with us a number. Is there a number around how large this economy is in dollars?
Yeah, sure. So when the estimates that we've seen out there, and one in particular that comes from the OECD, that what they did this whole study, is that at the moment, the blue economy is basically composed of about 1.5 trillion, growing to about 3 trillion in 2030. Now, those were estimates that were done many years ago. Now, this is obviously composed of a number of different industries globally. The way we look at it, obviously, is what are the companies within the publicly listed universe? And there you start to have companies that can range close to about 1,000 names, let's just say, in a number of different industries. And so the opportunity set is large. It's global in nature, but I'd say that there are pockets of growth in certain areas, and then there's other areas where they are mature industries. So I'll give you just an example where some of the growth that we're seeing continues to be and where we think it's actually going to be higher over the course of the next few years. So in the world of energy, offshore energy, obviously we've seen offshore wind. It's had its obviously headwinds here in the United States, but it continues to be a viable industry in Europe, and you're seeing a lot more interest in Asia. We do think this is one of the ways to really have utility scale renewable energy. And so this is one of the areas where you're going to see growth in terms of not only from a job perspective, but in terms of power generation in certain parts of the planet where offshore wind makes sense. So obviously that's just one pocket. Other areas that we're seeing growth in is in the world of aquaculture. One of the things we see, if you look at some of the research from the FAO, a lot of the species that are out there are overfished, and commercial fishing is basically hitting a plateau. And so what you're seeing to really fill in the gap in terms of the demand for protein, particularly from seafood-borne protein, is to develop aquaculture. And aquaculture is one area that we see growth in a number of different areas. Obviously, where we have the most exposure from a publicly listed universe is in around the salmon aquaculture infrastructure. Most of these companies are based in Europe, but there are some that are in Asia as well and in other parts of the world. But this is one area that you're starting to see an industrialization and automation of not only how to really manage the aquaculture process, but you're using technology now where it's land-based. You're putting more control. There's a lot more technology embedded, because now these companies want to scale the protein, aquaculture protein, to a level to meet the demand. Demand is not an issue in that industry. It's actually a question more of supply, because what we're seeing over the especially in the last decade, is that demand continues to increase, obviously not only in Europe and the US, but particularly in Asia. So that's one. And the last one I'll mention is in the shipbuilding ecosystem. You're going through what is a transitional period in the shipping industry where you're seeing a refresh of fleets from many different companies in and around the world. And that's reflected in the fact that the shipyards, which are mostly based in Asia, basically are full for the next 3 to almost 5 years. And so what you're seeing is a refresh in shipbuilding, in the types of ships necessary, not only to meet some of the new regulatory features that are coming from the IMO, but also companies want to have lower energy, more cost efficient and lower emission type ships. So all these things factor into what is a number of different technologies and a number of different components that are necessary for some of these new ships. That creates a whole ecosystem of companies that we think that we're seeing growth in now, but also there's a lot more visibility going forward. So I'm just giving you just some areas where you're seeing some real growth in the blue economy.
This episode is brought to you by ED4S, the sustainability training solution designed for scalable workforce training. ED4S makes it easy to build, launch, and maintain time-efficient, role-specific sustainability training for your teams. Developed by industry experts and trusted by leading organizations worldwide, visit ed4s.org to download a free case study and see how ED4S can work for you.
That gives us a great idea, kind of the broad scope of things. Thanks, Rolando. That's very good. Now, I think that leads to, how does the Ocean Engagement Fund itself balance financial returns with measurable ocean outcomes, and kind of what metrics do you use to prioritize and track impact? These are the industries that are coming. This is how the blue economy is changing and evolving. How do you look at that, and what metrics do you use?
Sure. So from our perspective, engagement is very important for this particular strategy. And there's really 2 reasons for it. One, we believe it can enhance company returns over time. And secondly, it can catalyze positive change. So let's go to the first. What we do in terms of shareholder engagement is have more of a, let's just say, be more constructive in terms of how we engage with our companies. We're trying to work with these companies. And what we're trying to really do is leverage the fact that we have a shareholder ownership in the company and work with them in terms of how they're thinking about their sustainability initiatives. For us, the sweet spot usually are, small, mid-sized companies that are early in the sustainability journey, but need some sort of guidance. And especially, if there is a long-term investor, there is some support, internally to be able to bring some of these initiatives up to management. And so what is it that we're trying to persuade them? What is it that we think that they can do? So staying ahead or understanding maybe what changing consumer preferences can be as it relates to ocean health and some of the sustainability aspects there. So some of the aspects there is we've engaged with companies in the cosmetic space, thinking about formulations, say for, sun tanning lotions, where, there's scientific research to basically say, some of the older formulations are actually quite adverse to a lot of the coral environments out there. Cosmetic companies have definitely understood this and have changed those formulations. In fact, for them, branding and marketing it in a very environmentally friendly way is actually something that is important for them. And we're seeing that. And we've been part of actually one of these engagements for one of these companies. Others is, shifting just to a more sustainable business model. We've had engagements with shipping companies that are wanting to really enhance their ship breaking practices. Now, what's ship breaking? Just think of the end of a useful life of a ship. And traditionally, what's happened before is they get sent to either India or Bangladesh to some, coastal area. The ship gets broken apart in a very unstandardized way. And some of the leading shipping companies have actually promoted certain protocols and standards where other companies are seeing this, and what we're trying to help companies do is understand what are the leading companies doing, because that is what gets companies the attention to really understand what they need to do to change. And then, usually what this does is it cuts waste, it cuts costs, and obviously that's what we want to see as well. A few other things, we want to obviously understand reputational risks. If it's consumer facing, we just mentioned one of the consumer companies, get ahead of regulatory risks. Regulation is an important aspect here in the blue economy, particularly in certain industries like shipping. So we want to get it. We want to see, are companies getting ahead of it? Do they just want to comply? Most companies want to really get ahead of it. And so that's a real thing. And then, improve their standings as well among the investment community. And then catalyzing positive change. This is where it's hard to measure, but nonetheless, this is where we want to see, obviously, a decrease in emissions. We want to see an improvement in terms of efficiency, whether it's water, whether it's energy. We want to see that some companies are actually measuring how they're protecting natural capital. And so for some companies, there's a more measurable way to go about it, where, they can give us some KPIs internally. And for others, it's part of it. It's also improving social outcomes. We've dealt with companies that have controversies with their shipping fleets. And so for us, having transparency into that supply chain and how they're actually deploying and how they're basically taking into some of the supply from some different suppliers is not only important for shareholders, but it's important also for some of their own clients. And these transparency issues are real, particularly when it comes to seafood traceability.
I mean, it sounds really fascinating, Rolando, to do what you're doing and to engage with companies around the blue economy. I'd like to touch on something. I mean, throughout this conversation, you talked about different sustainability kind of initiative or technologies or industries that are emerging or are impacting the ocean in some way. And I'd like to know whether you have an idea on whether certain sectors or areas within, whether it's ocean conservation or just the blue economy overall, are over-invested versus under-invested. And we see this in climate, for example, climate tech. You see there is a lot of investments in EVs and other sectors are neglected. Do you see that dynamic in the blue economy where there's a certain area that, maybe would benefit from additional investment and maybe others less so?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you the perspective from the Sustainable Development Goals. When people think, there's a number of reports out there in terms of investments, obviously, like you mentioned, going to climate, into different areas. The one area of underinvestment is in SDG 14, which is life below water. It's the least amount of investments for any of the SDGs out there. And so I'd say that this is one area where there's been underinvestment. I think it's underappreciated. However, I think what you've seen, especially in the last few years, is an emerging awareness and an emerging importance of the blue economy and thinking about ocean health. In fact, just this year alone, you saw the UN Ocean Conference and a number of initiatives that were born out of there. You saw in regulations coming from the IMO, the industries are taking these things seriously. And like I mentioned, this is leading to CapEx, it's leading to investments. And so there is a I'd say an emerging ecosystem of, let's just say, smaller companies, and you're seeing a number of venture capital firms that are focused in and around the blue economy. There's even venture capital arms for some of the companies that we've invested in that are looking for what are the new technologies, what are the emerging technologies whether it's in the seafood space, that is are there alternative type of seafood, type of proteins? Are there different technologies in the aquaculture space that can be used in order to lower mortality events and enhance the yield? So these and technologies, even in the shipping industry, there's new technologies for some of these ships to become more autonomous and to also implement, other environmental compliance technologies as well. And so to me, this is still nascent. It's emerging, but I certainly can see more investment in the space because of a number of factors, like I mentioned, more awareness, regulation, not only certain policies, but also the fact that companies are really starting to invest in these areas that I think are important.
Well, we've covered a lot. We've covered, from the very broad view, breaking down into industry by industry and new technologies. Now, I want to give you all the power in the world. You have a magic wand. You could do one thing with that magic wand, ocean related. What's one piece of regulation or a change in human culture or a change in investment that, from where you're sitting would do the most to protect the ocean and help the blue economy?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Matt. Let me try to address it from this way. One of the challenges we have is not that there's a lot of data out there. The problem with it is that it's all centered and housed in different parts, whether it's in one NGO or it's within a number of companies. And, none of this information is standardized. None of it is in a central place. And I feel like there's also a lot of efforts that are being duplicated in and around the world. And so you almost need a convening body to take in all this information and to basically focus all the activities on enhancing a lot of the initiatives that are out there. So one of the areas that I'm working with is with the UN Global Compact on the Ocean Investment Roundtable. They have this stewardship forum that tries to bring in participants from, different parts of the world of finance, which is pension funds, asset owners, asset managers, government entities, of course, and then academia. And the point of this is to try to have that convening effect where we can, really, not duplicate efforts, but try to put it all together. And I think that's part of some of the conferences that you've seen in the last few years. Again, the UN Ocean Conference. I think you're starting to see that. But if I had a magic wand, I'd say if we had that all in place, it would help to not only understand where we can focus in terms of investments, engage better, have apples to apples information so that you can ask the right questions. And then I think for companies to be able to direct investments easier as well. And so that would be, I think, the dream state if I had that magic wand. But I think we're heading in that direction. Unfortunately, it will take some time. You've seen that obviously in other aspects of ESG or sustainability. I'd say we're probably an earlier stage with the blue economy in terms of having all that information, really get to the point where it becomes more standardized and can be useful for different participants.
Yeah, while you were saying, and that's a great answer. And I would agree, not knowing what you know, but that sounds like where we were with sustainability and ESG, years ago, where, things like it was SASB, now it's part of ISSB, the old materiality map they had, where you could go sector by sector, industry by industry, and look at, okay, these are the 4 or 5 or 6 most material things in this industry. And the blue economy is so new to a lot of people. You're going to be going through that same process. So I hope you get that magic wand. I hope that happens. And it sounds like it is. I'm not at the...
And like I mentioned, there are a number of, let's say, organizations trying to do this. I'm going to mention one, the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy that I did advise for years ago, and still follow their work. They have tried doing this convening work where they've put together information from different industries. And I think that, in essence, started a lot of this and has become a platform. But I do think that obviously more needs to happen. But this is where, it's helpful for people like us that need information, that we need to make informed decisions, but also it helps to engage with companies and for companies themselves as well to make their decisions in terms of investments and what they think and what should be important.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rolando, for joining us today. And I'm sure our listeners got a lot out of this conversation. Thank them for tuning in. This podcast is just one of the ways ED4S supports sustainability education. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Noir.
If today's episode sparked ideas for your team, visit ed4s.org. That's ed4s.org to explore our customizable corporate learning solutions or book a quick discovery call. You don't have to figure it out alone.